Welcome to Mindrolling, and I'm Raghu Marcus.
And I'm David Silver, and we're very happy that you've tuned us in again.
And we are, this is actually the opportunity that we had to do several podcasts on location. And we are one of the people that we've been talking about it being with Ram Dass and Krishna Das. And we happen to have one of the attendees, actually, to the retreat, a good friend of Ram Dass's. His name is Mickey Lemle, and he did this incredible film that has turned on so many people called Fierce Grace. And it's about what happened to Ram Dass after he had that massive stroke and almost died in the late 90s. And we were David knows him pretty well, so you talk about it.
We were really lucky to get Mickey because, in my opinion, he's really unique. I've made films about spiritual matters. It's very difficult to make a documentary about such things. In fact, it's enjoyable, but it's not necessarily, doesn't get through all the time. And he did with Fierce Grace, because here's a film not only about one of the greatest teachers of our time, but about the situation he found himself in after a major stroke. And Mickey's film is just state of the art in terms of all of those matters, all of those serious matters. Mickey's also made many films, actually, and got many awards. One of his most interesting and compelling films is a film called Compassion in Exile, the story of the 14th Dalai Lama. Like, it's hard to imagine a more important subject in our day, in our time, than that. And it was a very, very successful film in terms of critics and everybody else. Mickey's, he's got Emmys, he's got Golden Eagle Awards. He's a successful filmmaker, but more important than that, he's focused upon matters of the heart and spirit and managed to make films that are incredibly articulate and moving about those subjects. So we're kind of honored to have him, and he's a friend and a lovely guy. So there he was in at the retreat, and we were happy to talk to him. Just to digress for a moment, it's not really a digression. If you want to support us, and we hope you do, you can use two portals on the Mindrolling site that will take you either to audible.com, the audiobook company, preeminent audiobook, or Amazon, which we all know about. And it makes it possible for you to, oh dear. What was that? What was that?
Don't worry about it. It's just a podcast.
I just thought
somebody's hammering outside my.
Someone's hammering. Okay.
What can I do?
Okay. All right. Well, that's fine. It just stopped me in my tracks for a minute. But anyway, if you go actually to audibletrial.com/mindrolling, audibletrial.com/mindrolling, or you just go to our site and hit it. You can buy a free book for a month from them, or not buy, you can get a free book from them for a month and then afterwards buy them. Every time you get something through them, we get a small percentage, and it helps us continue with the podcast. Same goes for the Amazon portal.
Well, wait. Here's a perfect example. You're talking about Mickey Lemle, and I mentioned that movie Fierce Grace. And folks, go to our site. This is something you're going to enjoy for sure. Go to our site, and you'll see the Amazon banner. Just link to it and look up Fierce Grace and get a copy of that movie and invite your friends over. I mean, it is a truly amazing, heart-connecting film about Ram Dass. And it's more than about Ram Dass. It's about somebody who got us, he just about died. He had a massive stroke, and how he came back from that, and his relationship with faith, losing faith, getting it back, how to deal. I mean, Ram Dass is, many of you know who he is, and his gift, he was the Lenny Bruce, or he had the gift of gab like nobody had, and talked about, so many people came to understand how to trod onto this path of life because of him. And can you imagine that was taken away from him in 1 second? And how he dealt with this afterwards. I mean, it's just amazing. It's an amazing film. So by doing so, you will get all the enjoyment of watching this beautiful film and help out us little guys here at mindrollingpodcast.com. So
Yeah, so listen to our conversation with Mickey, and see what you think about it. He knows a lot, and he tells us a lot about what he's been doing. Very interesting, right?
Yep.
Right?
Here you go. Mickey Lemle on location with Mindrolling.
Hello again. This is Mindrolling with me, David Silver, and Raghu Marcus, and a great guest. Great guest.
And a great spot. I mean, we're in a great
Yeah.
spot.
The guest is Mickey Lemle. The spot is
Maui, the Open Your Heart in Paradise retreat. We're all hanging with Ram Dass, Krishna Das, having a wonderful time and sitting with some of the teachers. And then we found our friend here. He was wandering outside. We got him in though. Okay, but you know, Mickey, of course, is known by many of you. We get in my dual role as director of the Love Serve Remember Foundation. So I do get a lot of mail that I get to see, and a lot of people honestly say, we saw Fierce Grace, and it absolutely changed our lives, our perspective, the whole thing. This is the truth. You already know this because you get tons of feedback yourself, but it's a pretty amazing vehicle, this film. So I'd love for you to talk about how did it come about? I don't even know how. I mean, I've known Mickey forever. I don't know how it came about, the actual genesis. Let's start there.
Well, I've known Ram Dass for 35 years. I first met him on Martha's Vineyard in the early 70s. I was there visiting a friend of mine, Peter Simon, and he said, "Hey, you got to come hear this guy." And he said his name's Ram Dass, and he's speaking in the local church in Vineyard Haven. And I thought, a white guy named Ram Dass speaking in a church. I said, "Okay, I'll sit in the back on the aisle, and I'll give it about 15 minutes." And I was transfixed for 3.5 hours. My mind never wandered to the past or the future. And he was such a brilliant storyteller. And what was amazing about it was that there was no hiatus between the form and the content of what he spoke about that night. It was basically that we are both human and divine simultaneously, and we have to hold the tension in those things. And his stories were exactly that. He would talk about his own personal experience, falling down on the path, his mess ups and so forth, and then go to these metaphysical realms and discuss them in a way that I finally could understand them, having read all these books but never quite getting it. And I thought, okay, anytime he's speaking in a city that I'm in, I'll go hear him. And then it became, I'll fly to Esalen to spend a weekend with him, and over the years we became friends. And he was working on a slide tape at one point that he was trying to put together, and a whole bunch of mutual friends kept saying, "You got to talk to Mickey about this." He was having some problems with structure. So I watched it, and I said, "It's great. You just have to take the beginning and move it to the end. Take the end, put it in the middle." And I, restructured it so it would work. And he was a little bit taken aback at first, but then he tried it and he saw that it actually worked. And then he performed the marriage of me and my ex-wife, and wouldn't give me any money back when it failed. And then in 1992, I came out with the first major movie about the Dalai Lama. And one of the early screenings was at this big international conference that was being held in Prague, the ITA conference, International Transpersonal Association conference, that was being held in Prague that year. And he was one of the speakers. And I had just finished the movie, and so this was one of the first big audiences. And he sat right in the front row. And after the movie, he came up to me and he said, "I love this movie." He said, "I want you to bring it to my next retreat. I want you to talk about it. I want you to talk about Tibet." And I said, "Okay, but you're next." And he said, No, not now. And so then a few years later, I was at another conference, this time in Manaus in the middle of the Amazon in Brazil. And he also was one of the speakers. And I showed this movie that I had just finished about Sir Lawrence van der Post, a wonderful South African explorer, philosopher. And after the movie came up, he said, "I love this movie." He said, "I need copies of it to give to these people. I want you to show it at my next retreat." And I said, "Okay, Baba, but you're next." He said, No, I'm not ready. So a few weeks after the conference, he wrote me a letter and he said, "Someday someone will make a movie about me, and it should be you, but I'm not ready. I'm changing how I do things and so on." And then after the stroke, a couple of months after he got out of the hospital, I went to visit him up in Marin. And we were just hanging out on the porch for the afternoon. And toward the end of the afternoon, I said, Baba, maybe we should make this movie. And he said, okay. And so when I got back to New York, I wrote to him because I didn't want to take advantage of him or anything. So I said, I think this is what we agreed to. And he wrote back and said, yeah, let's do it. And one of the things that he said to me on the porch that day was, he said, this is not who I thought I was going to be, because my vision of myself old didn't have a stroke in it. He said, if I think about who I was supposed to be or who I used to be, it just brings up tremendous suffering for me. He said, but if I just rest in awareness, I'm in bliss. And in a strange way, it mirrored artistically what I had to do in making the movie, because I'd been carrying around a movie for 8 years in my head. I knew just how to structure it. And for the non-filmmakers out there, film's all about structure. It's really about how you tell the story and how you give the audience information they need to have an emotional involvement and then finally reaction to it. And so I knew how I would structure this movie for 8 years. I knew what stories of his I wanted. I knew how the order. I knew all that stuff. And he couldn't do any of that, because he couldn't tell any of the old stories. It would take him 15, 20 minutes. And, you're not going to wait around, So I had to let go of all of the stuff that I had been carrying around and just see what was in front of me every day. And then that's what we filmed, and over a couple of years, basically. And so the film sort of grew and evolved, but it was just what was in front of me.
Do you have any idea of the effect that this would have? Forget about just what a wonderful impression of a man going through something like this and coming out the other side. I mean, that's Fierce Grace. But my surprise, not surprise, but so many people deeply transformed. I mean, again, I had you any idea?
You always, when I start a project, I always hope that it'll make people laugh, it'll make them cry, and if they're open to it, it could change their lives for the better. And this movie just touched people so profoundly, so deeply. I mean, we opened it theatrically in New York City. It was just after 9/11, and after the opening night, there was people crowded around, and told me about how much they liked the movie and so forth. And there's this big burly guy in the back, and he was just waiting for everybody to sort of finish. And when everybody had left, he came up to me and he said, "I'm a New York City fireman, and I lost 100 friends on 9/11." He said, "This was the first time I was able to really feel the grief."
Really?
And so then I was able to talk the theater owners into letting any policemen or firemen or their families in for free. And the number of people and messages and letters and emails that both Ram Dass and I get over the years of people saying, it just happened to me recently, this woman came up to me and said, "I lost my beautiful 18-year-old daughter in a snowstorm last winter in a car accident." She said, "It was only seeing your movie every day that got me through." And I know Ram Dass has gotten a bunch of people.
Yeah, but I'll tell you, I'm talking about people that nothing tragic has happened to them. They've actually been, the transformation has been into a spiritual realm of just not having real contact, especially since he's been, way broadly more out there through Oprah interviews and all that stuff. So there's people that don't know the backstory at all and don't have any just suddenly they were confronted with, wow, there's a real way to have compassion for people. There's a real way to open your heart. That alone, that kind of. I want to ask you one other thing. I'm sorry.
No, I'm happy to listen.
Well, I'll just say that he has helped more people open their hearts than anybody I know.
Yeah.
In his 50 years of teaching. Yeah. And he has been the way in to a sense for people, for a sense of their own spirits, as much as anybody that I've ever met.
Absolutely.
No, absolutely. Now, the one more thing that I wanted to ask was, he speaks about Fierce Grace, that he originally, during the making of this movie, Fierce Grace, what it meant to him was, he was given a stroke by his guru, and then it got, converted. But it was the Fierce Grace. Got this happened to him from his guru, and then he realized that it was grace. He could become more quiet, less, in the future or the past and so on. Then 2 years, he spoke about it actually at this retreat, and you were there. And we've talked about it, but when he was told by the resident saint now, at our guru's temples, he was told Maharaji would never give you a stroke. That is illusion. The stroke was nature, whatever your karma was. And he's like realized, okay, well, then what I did get, what the grace was, to be able to have the awareness to have a different perspective to deal with it.
Yes.
But is it true that during the film, I mean, in your knowledge, the making of the film, it was Maharaji gave him that stroke?
Well, he said in Still Here, he said, I was stroked by my guru.
Yeah.
And what he said in the movie, I believe it's in one of the interviews, is he said, after being with Maharaji, coming back from India, he saw everything in his life as Maharaji's grace. So if he was driving to the post office and said, God, I hope I find a parking space in front, and if there was a parking space, he would say, thank you, Maharaji. He saw everything, everybody who came into his life as Maharaji's grace. So that when the stroke happened, then he had to reconcile everything is his guru's grace and the stroke, and he was trying to hold both, and that was very tricky in the very beginning. And then he saw that it was grace, but it was fierce grace. It was he called it heavy grace, and at one point fierce grace.
Right.
And that's when I was going to call it Being Here Now, and then all of a sudden I heard that, and I thought, okay, that's the title.
Yeah, right,
yeah. But my uncle had exactly the same stroke. He was paralyzed on his right side. He had speech aphasia. All he could say was basically two things: "What's the deal?" and "bullshit." Now in New York, that gets you through 80% of your conversations.
Right.
But he woke up in hell every morning because he'd been a bomber pilot during the war. He skied 6 months of the year. He could do chin-ups on the door jamb. I mean, he was physically incredibly fit. He loved drinking and eating great food and beautiful women. And here he is with this, his body, was not who he thought he was supposed to be. And he woke up in hell every morning for the last 5 years of his life. And so, the thing that Ram Dass has shown us, and I honestly believe, and I have no way of knowing this, but for the first 2 months after the stroke, he was in the hospital with tubes going in and out. He couldn't swallow, couldn't eat, couldn't speak. And the doctor said, the attending doctor said, he's either going to be like this or he's going to die. He's never going to make any improvement. And I think it was touch and go whether or not he was going to live. And one day, a friend went to see him who'd been seeing him every day. And he came out and he said, he wants to live. And I believe that he made a decision that he would come back and go through all of the incredibly painful rehabilitation and the therapies and all that, and the inconveniences and the all of that, all the dependencies and all the changes that he's had to go through to tell us what it's like, and that you can do it in a way other than my uncle did it, which was just, and that's the fierce grace, is that you even with this you can still have this amazing life. I mean, this last chapter has validated all of his earlier teachings. And for someone who's been teaching more or less for 50 years, to have, I remember when I first started the movie, I was speaking to this woman at a reception who'd known Ram Dass from Harvard days, Richard. And she said, sometimes I'd listen to his talks and I wasn't sure if I totally believed everything he said. She said, looking at the way he's been dealing with the stroke, I now believe him.
Oh, that's such a big point. Oh.
And so to validate all of his teaching is fierce grace. I mean, he had to pay a hell of a price to get there, but that's fierce grace. That's what that night I changed the title.
Right, I bet.
What was it? Heavy Grace? Heavy Grace?
Fierce Grace.
Before that? Before
that it was Being Here Now.
Oh, really?
Yeah. And that was the working title. And then after I had that conversation with the woman, I changed the title.
Do you think that part of the sort of magnetism of your film is because it's not just, like Roger was saying, it's not just people who've got similar circumstances, But for me, it gives you perspective on much lesser things that are driving you crazy. In other words, you know, how many of us are in a wheelchair who are one of the greatest speakers on the history of the planet, articulators of the language, who stop from, we don't have to say how fierce that is. But for someone who's just got little problems here and there, like most people have most of the time, you see a film like this, puts you in your place, kind of.
Well,
you know, do you agree?
No. When I first finished the film, I was very curious about the response, especially of younger people. And my nephew was in an acting class in Santa Monica, and his teacher was a huge.
That's where at the airport.
At the airport, you're
Yeah.
Yeah,
That's now I remember.
yeah, and he invited me to come to show the movie.
That's where we
and
were.
at that point, I was really curious to see what 20-year-olds would think of it.
I remember you telling me that.
They didn't, they didn't know from him. They didn't know from the '60s.
Right.
They were 20-year-olds and they're actors, so and this one girl was crying at the end, and she said, "Everybody who thinks they're suffering should see this movie."
Right.
Right?
Right. Right.
All right, your turn to
Well,
change the
not
channel.
really, because this is just such a big thing to talk about. Perspective, like as you're saying, that this morning at the Mala giving with Ram Dass, we were all, moved beyond anything you can say. It was just beyond. I can't even articulate language about it because it's an incredible feeling. And from that, I want to ask about, spirituality as a whole is a weird subject to make films about because it's not exoteric, it's esoteric, if you like. You can't show objects and stuff. But you overcame that in Fierce and in other films, which we'll talk about in a minute. But can you talk about that a little bit?
Well, I've been thinking about this subject for 30 years, about how to make movies about spiritual matters. And what I think is that spiritual consciousness shifts are an internal event, and movies by their nature are about external action.
Right.
And so that's the dilemma.
Right.
And the other thing is, I think that gaining spiritual enlightenment is a lot like picking your nose. It's fine when you're doing it yourself, but watching someone else do it isn't that interesting.
That's correct.
So, watching a bunch of people sitting around getting enlightened is like really boring movie. So the art form is to find metaphors that reflect the spirit, the internal transformations, but through external action. So one of my other movies that I made is about the men who went to the moon and what happened to them spiritually on their journeys, and then what happened in the 20 years after in their lives. Because it's a visual metaphor. There's, you can see it, but it reflects the internal changes. The film I did on the Dalai Lama, again, it was about how he was confronting the Chinese invasion and genocide of his people. So it's about external action, but it was also about internal transformation. So that's the whole thing. I mean, otherwise you get into the somebody. I mean, the thing is, you could have somebody sitting on a rock and film them, for a half hour, and then all of a sudden they get enlightened, and how would you know, right?
No, but this is, I mean, Fierce Grace is an absolutely unique situation.
Yes.
I mean, obviously people have strokes and people are articulate who have strokes, but people who've experienced a great ascended master who articulated about that, it's like making a film about spirituality and did it for us. He talked about Maharaji in a way that people like me who didn't meet him got it. And it's kind of like the same thing. He was so brilliant, is so brilliant, at letting us know what happened, along with his satsang brothers and sisters, our satsang brothers and sisters. It's sort of like the same story, He was able to transcend just mouthing cliches about light and love and granola, and never did that. He was always essentially pragmatic, right?
Well, he
You agree?
I've known three brilliant storytellers in my life, and he was Joseph Campbell, Ram Dass, and Spalding Gray.
Mm-hmm.
And when any of them would tell a story, my mind never wandered. And otherwise, and I'm very strict. I mean, my mind wanders pretty quickly if somebody's boring, and he was, he.
Well, you know, I worked with Spalding, and I made a record with him, and the thing about Spalding and Roundhouse that's similar was that they're both blindingly honest at all times. Spalding particularly. Genius, really, and very spiritual, actually. His interview with His Holiness is one of the most interesting things I've ever read. Spalding, when he interviewed him, was entirely different from anybody else except Larry King.
Yeah.
Remember the Larry King?
But Larry King was not a good interviewer.
No,
not
Spalding was great.
But when Ramdas has this unbelievable ability to articulate things that nobody else can in that way.
That's right.
With humor, and the thing is, like when I interview these great beings, like the Dalai Lama, let's say, and they say something that's a big general statement about the nature of things, and you hear it and you go, oh, I need to write that down and put it on my refrigerator so that's the first thought I have every morning. I'm going to get my friend who does calligraphy to do a really nice version of it, and then I'm going to put it right on the refrigerator, and so every morning before I have my tea, I'm going to read that, and it'll set up my whole day, and my life will change. So the first morning you read it, and you go, God, that is so true. And then the second morning you go, I need the milk. And the thing is that big general statements actually, they're not rooted. So when the Dalai Lama, for instance, if I was interviewing him and he would say one of these great general statements, the follow-up question would be, and when did that happen in your life? When did that occur in your life? Tell me about that time. Because what I would always do is root those big ideas into personal experience. And when they're rooted in personal experience, then you can't argue with them. You can't say that's not true, because the person said, that's what happened to me. You can argue with ideas. You can argue with, in the case of the Dalai Lama, with political positions. But you can't argue with experience. If somebody says, this is what happened to me and I cried, you can't say, well, no, you didn't really feel that.
Right. Tell us something.
I mean, you can if you're married to them, but...
That's another here.
Tell us something about His Holiness. Something, personal experience.
Yeah, anything.
Yeah, anything.
He is one of the funniest people I know. He always surprises me with incredible humor, and he has one of the most amazing minds on the planet. I mean, he's the breadth of what his understanding is, the depth of what his understanding is, and his humor about it is irresistible. And he's in my mind, he's the real thing.
Okay, you have to root that in a story. Personal experience.
Yeah.
Well, I went to see him. The movie I made about him, Compassion in Exile, was like the first major movie about him that was done, and it showed all over the world and was quite well received. And I was invited to the Bombay Film Festival, and it did very well there. And then there was a week hiatus, and I was invited to the first Kathmandu Film Festival.
Wow.
To show the movie. And in between, I had a week, and it happened to be Tibetan New Year. And so I went up to Dharamsala to hang out, and I was staying with his brother, his younger brother, who's also a recognized reincarnated Rinpoche. And one morning at 4 a.m, he said, get up. I said, what? He said, come with me. And we drive up, and there, we're sitting on the roof of his temple, and the Dalai Lama's there with 100 monks, and they're chanting, bringing in the dawn and the new year. And they're throwing barley and drinking chai, and just as the sun rose, an eagle landed right behind him, over his shoulder. And anyway, a day later, I got to have a private audience with him, and we were talking about the movie, and it was him and me and his main assistant, and we were having a private audience, and I was going to ask him about Sir Lawrence Vanderpost. I was just starting that movie, and one of the things that Sir Lawrence talked about, which drew me to make the movie, was about the violence committed by righteous victims. And so I thought I would talk to him about that. But then, as I'm sitting there, I'm thinking, Mickey, you've got this, every time you were with him, it was professional. I was always thinking about the movie. And I never really, and I filmed a lot of people opening up about the deepest question in their heart. And when anybody was about to meet him for the first time, they would say, what do I say? And I said, always come with a question. And I would say, ask him the deepest question in your heart. Don't waste it on, how about those nicks? You know, it's like, and that would start them on their own little journey as to what's the deepest question in my heart at this moment in my life.
Right.
And so the deepest question was about my divorce, which was, we'd been trying for a year and a half to mediate it. And just before I left on the trip, my future ex-wife said, we were this close to having a settlement. And she thought, if he wants to do it, it must be bad for me. So she turned it over to Mia Farrow's lawyer, who was this terrible human being. And I was really depressed because I was trying to. We had a 3-year-old son, and I was trying to keep it out of court and all this sort of thing. And so I asked him about it, and you know, I said, what do you do with someone who brings up anger all the time? And he said, well, who is it? And then, you know, I went through all this thing. And I thought he was going to give me like a Tara meditation, you know, where you visualize a Tara on your head, the dripping green, and, you know. And he said, you know, you have to stand up for what's right. He said, you cannot let people roll over you. He said, just don't be attached to the outcome. And, you know, he said, if I think about going back to Tibet every day, he said, I can't do that. I just have to, every day have to do something to get back, but I don't worry about the outcome. And in fact, as you know, that's the essence of the Bhagavad Gita. It's what Krishna says to Arjuna. It's like, you do your job impeccably and leave the outcome to us.
Yeah.
And so that was...
He gave you the Bhagavad Gita, His Holiness.
Yeah, in a Buddhist kind of way, yeah.
Buddhist way.
But anyway, so...
Well, let's just do this. You're doing another film, or an adaptation, a renewal.
A new movie, yeah.
What's new?
Well, a lot's changed in 20 years.
Yeah.
You know, when I first made the movie 20 years ago, nobody really knew very much about him. They didn't know very much about Tibet or what was going on in Tibet. And I thought, naively, I thought if the world just knew about it, it would have to change. That the first step in any kind of transformation is observation or information. So I thought the best way to bring world attention to what was going on in Tibet was through his story. So if I just told it, you know, because contained in his stories is the whole situation with China and so forth.
Yeah.
But with an emotional, it's not an issue movie. It's an emotional thing. And I don't know if this is, but when PBS, when I first, I'd been making movies for PBS since the early 70s. And so I did series for them and all specials, and you know, and I sent it down to them when it was an idea on paper, and they sent it back and said no. And then I went and filmed it, and British Television came in as a co-producer, and we filmed it, and I sent it down, and they said no. So finally, when it was done, I sent it down, and I got a call from PBS, and they said, we're concerned about your journalism. And I said, what time tomorrow morning can I come see you? And they said 11. I said, fine. I took the plane down, went. So I said, what's your problem? They said, well, you don't really present the Chinese point of view in a way that an open-minded...
we've had the same experiences
that an open-minded viewer could make up their own mind. Yes. And I said, you know, being Jewish, it's really hard to make a case for genocide, which she missed completely. It just went right over her head.
Oh,
And then I said, but you know, this is not an issue movie. This is not Tibet and China, the issue. I said, this is a portrait of an individual human being.
Yeah.
And it's his story. It's not an issue story. This is what's happened to him in his life. So they finally put it on.
Was this GBH or
no? This was PBS in Washington.
Oh, yeah.
So they finally put it on, and it did really well. And I believe the movie has shown every day since I released it 20 years ago. And the reason, it's a little bit of a cheat because there's a tea shop in Dharamsala and a tea shop in Kathmandu that shows it every afternoon at 4. But I was making a movie with my son in Bhutan a couple of years ago, and he came back from a marketplace. He said, Dad, they've got your movie. And it was a bootleg copy that they were selling in the bazaar there. So.
Well, this is tremendous. I mean, who you've worked with, your life's work, what it's been involved with, Mickey, is...
and your true inspiration.
This is great.
A television show in Boston, I believe.
I was totally inspired. When I was a student at Brandeis in 1968, there was a program on called What's Happening, Mr. Silver. And it was so radical and such a breakthrough that it led me to think, well, if he can do it, anybody can do it.
Well, listen, we're going to end on that note. If he can do it, anybody can do it. My buddy Dave. But we really thank you.
Got to thank
Mickey.
the amazingly articulate. It's an amazing filmmaker who's articulate about his films or her films.
Yeah,
Very much. People
so.
usually aren't. You know. So.
But
I loved everything you said.
yeah,
Well,
thanks
you.
for the offering.
Thank
and that's it from Mindrolling, episode God only knows. We're here in Maui. We have no idea, Dave, what time
It's
has
15,
gone
16,
by.
or 17.
I'm not trying to be practical.
It's December 2012.
Oh, good. Thank you. That was Mickey Lemle, and quite a bunch of interesting different information. We weren't even knowing what he was going to talk about, and I loved when he talked about His Holiness the Dalai Lama, because I love that being so much, and he had this personal interaction with him. That was just terrific. He is an accomplished, amazing guy, Mickey.
Yeah, and you can count the number of great films about, shall we say, spiritual matters on just a few hands, actually. I mean, it's amazing. I mean, Werner Herzog's done some great work there and so on. But Mickey Lemle has to be praised for doing a film that got through to a lot of people who really didn't know much about Ram Dass, and certainly didn't know much about what it was like to deal with a stroke. So, and come out of it even higher, you know. Mickey did that. So thanks, Mickey, for doing that with us. And thank you, everybody, for listening. We'll remind you one more time to go to Mindrolling, our website, Mindrolling Podcast, and check out the portals, Amazon and Audible, to get books or anything else you want from those guys, tapes, whatever they sell, cars, you know. And every time you get something through our portal, it helps support this podcast, which we assume you like, or you wouldn't be listening. You'd be, you know, watching I Want to Be a Millionaire or something on television. So
Dave wants to be a millionaire. So
Yeah.
if you do buy a Porsche or a Ferrari or something on Amazon, I mean, boy, that percentage could put him well on his way. I mean,
yeah. It's called Who Wants to Be a Millionaire, actually, and it's a good show. But I'm glad
Why
you're
do you
listening-
want to be?
I'm glad you're listening to us and not watching it right now.
Well, and we look forward to joining you again next week on mindrollingpodcast.com.